Thank you, Josh. That was a super fascinating session about yields on publicly traded products. If you just joined us, I really encourage you to head up to the rooftop. There's some amazing swag. You can get personalized leather keychains, t-shirts, bandanas. So check that out. But our next session here on the tech stage is for the builders. So 40% of Bitcoin builders are building on layers today. And our next session is going to tell us how they're building the tools to help those people create better experiences with Bitcoin. So welcome up, Elena, and the rest of your panel.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I really like the silent disco feeling. I almost want to break out into a disco,
Right.
but perhaps that would be for the happy hour. So my name is Elena. I run product marketing at Hiro, and we're a developer tooling company for Bitcoin layers like Stacks, Ordinals, and most recently Runes. And I'm joined today by my colleagues Rafa and Eric. So yeah, we want to share some insights today. We like developer tooling is our bread and butter. We just heard from Josh, who is painting this picture about how awesome and ambitious and incredible the opportunity is in Bitcoin layers. But developers need tools. We need shovels, picks, axes to build all this stuff, and that's what we do at Hero. So yeah, we're gonna get started with intros for just a little bit, but a few of the things that we want to talk about are like common pitfalls or roadblocks that developers are seeing as they're trying to realize their vision on Bitcoin layers. And now Hero is building tools to hopefully meet those needs and address those pain points. So yeah, why don't we do intros? Rafa, Eric, tell us a bit about your background.
Sure. Yeah, my name is Rafael. I've been working at Hero for 3 years now. And I actually come from a Web 2 background. I used to work for Google before for a few years. And for me, the developer experience is something that's very important because obviously having products, technological products that you want users to use is impossible without the tools to build them, right? And if we want to see Bitcoin become this, global settlement layer like we've all discussed for a long time, we need people to be able to build apps. So that's one of the reasons why I joined Hero in the first place, because coming from a Web 2 background, the tools on that ecosystem are very mature at this point. So I wanted to get a challenge of building that similar experience on the Web3 world where everything is very new, right? So that's basically what I do right now.
Eric, how about you?
Yeah, so my name is Eric. I am a developer advocate at Hero. Um, I'm still actually fairly new to Hero. I've only been at Hero for about 4 months, but have been following the Stacks ecosystem for a few years now. Um, Before Hero, I was working at a Bitcoin wallet team, a Bitcoin cold storage team. And then I would say for the most part, a lot of my Bitcoin journey has been kind of very Bitcoin focused and related. But then I think back in 2021, when I fumbled across Stacks, I think that opened up the world to like, oh, okay, well, this is still Bitcoin related, but this can make Bitcoin a lot more fun and interactive in many ways. And I think as a developer advocate for Hero, I think my main duties is to support that education and support evangelism of Bitcoin layers and how one can start building on Bitcoin layers.
Nice. Okay, so one of the things that I want to kind of cover today, and we touched on it a little bit in the intros, is that developers come to Bitcoin layers from all different backgrounds. Some developers come from like a Bitcoin first or Bitcoin only background, and so their mental models or what they're expecting in tooling is very different from somebody who comes from Web 2 or somebody who comes from all the way over in like Web 3 Ethereum land. So I'd love to hear you guys talk a little bit about, do you remember what your first experience was like when you were trying to build something on Bitcoin or a Bitcoin layer? Like what was the most frustrating part, or what was the tooling like when you first tried?
Yeah, for me, it was a very interesting learning experience for sure, because again, when I joined Hero, coming from a Web 2 world, I had no idea about anything related to blockchains. I mean, I obviously knew about Bitcoin, but only from a consumer standpoint, like from somebody who bought and hodled Bitcoin. But actually getting to build stuff on Bitcoin and stacks, for me, was a very long process of, first of all, learning all the concepts, because it's very different to write applications for a distributed system like a blockchain than it is from a centralized system like a server or like a Web 2 server, right? So in that way, I first had to understand what happens in a blockchain, like what is, like from the very beginning, like what is a transaction, how is it confirmed, what are blocks, what are the roles of mining, and then once you get to understand these concepts, you start to understand what you can do with the tools that you have to build applications using these concepts, right? So I think that is a particular challenge that we have as builders of developer tools.
Yeah.
Like we need to bridge that gap of understanding for engineers that know how to do software engineering, but they don't know about all the concepts of a blockchain and of Web3 in general, right? So that I think gets resolved by different means. Like obviously you need very strong documentation, you need good examples, you need great tools that are easy to use, you need communities. So it's like a sum of all parts kind of thing. But when I started, things were not as robust as they are today. So it was definitely much more difficult to learn. And I'm glad to see that the things that we've built at Hiro, for example, speaking from experience, now make this journey much easier and much quicker for new developers that are joining the ecosystem.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm curious, like, if there was a specific, because you mentioned like coming from a Web 2 learning blockchain. There's the inverse as well, like people who they first cut their teeth, like they're straight out of college, and like blockchain is their first experience, and then as they kind of want to build more robust and resilient tools, they have to pick up some of like the Web 2 best practices. Eric, you you meet a lot of people at hackathons. What do you think the kind of like developer onboarding experience is like when people are first starting either at Stacks or Bitcoin layers? Like what is the roadblocks that they hit like in the first few hours of trying to make their dreams come true on Bitcoin?
Yeah, I think for many new developers to Stacks, I think the biggest roadblock in the beginning is clarity.
Yeah.
Clarity smart contracts, which is the smart contract language on Stacks. It's very different from Solidity or JavaScript, which many new web developers usually start into. So that's the biggest hurdle, right? It's being able to like get over reading that particular syntax or understanding. I think one person put it so well, like it's that Polish notation for like mathematical operations on Clarity. Instead of kind of having the syntax laid out as 1 + 1, you would have +1 and then 1. But I think for a lot of them, their feedback to me was that they've been able to kind of onboard into learning Clarity through our dev tools. So like Clarinet, for example, the REPL in Clarinet as well. Even a lot of the checker systems in Clarinet has solidified their understanding of how to properly construct the syntax of Clarity. Other than that, I think I guess for Bitcoin on the main chain, that itself has its own host of learning curves and kind of development roadblock. I would say in general, it's easier to build on a Bitcoin layer 2 than a Bitcoin L1, just because I think it's natural for when you come across a lot of the dev tools for Bitcoin layers 2, a lot of them are very set up in a way where the instructions and the layout is very specific. And I think that's just the nature of the teams behind it, right? The teams are trying to make it as easy as possible to build on layer 2s. Whereas, Bitcoin, on Bitcoin, the main chain, on layer 1, if you take Bitcoin JS, for example, I mean, there's actually no real like documentation for Bitcoin JS. There's no official docs for Bitcoin JS. So even a lot of new developers, they need to kind of, rummaged through a bunch of different kind of unofficial docs just for Bitcoin JS, right? And I think Bitcoin JS is probably the best way for a new developer to get into Bitcoin building. But even Bitcoin JS has its issues of, being a lot more easier to consume. So yeah, I think, Bitcoin Layer 2s, I think the teams behind the Bitcoin Layer 2 dev tools are doing a good job of making their developer tools and building on their networks a lot more easier because they understand that, having good documentation is important, like what Rafael said, and also having what may seem trivial, but having a good plethora of YouTube videos for developers to look at and reference. So.
Yeah. So both of you guys mentioned like one of the biggest pain points of this learning curve is keeping it all straight. So there's all the stuff that happens at the Bitcoin L1. And Bitcoin L1 has its own very specific idiosyncrasies as opposed to like the Web3 world, which maybe, the virtual machine is at the base layer. And so, if I'm going to do smart contracts, I can have smart contracts all the way up and all the way down. Whereas Bitcoin has like its unique properties that people have to learn about, like, it's a UTXO model versus an account-based model. And if I want an application that supports both, how am I going to do that? It's like a really interesting challenge. And then you have to decide between all these layer 2s or these layers built on top of Bitcoin. And so what are the trade-offs you're willing to make? If you guys are in the audience, like if some of you are deciding between doing a sidechain or a roll-up or building on top of a meta protocol like Ordinals, there's a whole nother level of education that you need to do there. And all of that is before you even decide what you want to build. Like, are you trying to do an application or a wallet or another protocol? So let's talk about tools that developers have at their disposal. One of the tools that Hiro's worked on recently is Chainhook. Rafa, you're one of the mad geniuses behind that. Can you talk a little bit about what Chainhook, the problem it's meant to solve, and how it can apply to stacks and ordinals and runes?
Sure. So basically, when you're trying to build an application that uses for example, Bitcoin data, and you want to take an action when something happens, either on Bitcoin or on stacks or on ordinals or runes, you want a mechanism that can notify you when that thing happens. And that's where Chainhook comes in. It basically is a system that allows you to subscribe to events that happen on the chain or on one of these meta protocols. And then you get a notification on your server when that event happens with obviously all the information that you need about such event. And the reason why this is important is that if you're building, let's say, an application that wants to use ordinals, for example, you don't want to spend time actually building all the tools underneath just to get a message when something happens on chain, right? You want to spend your time actually building the solution that you want or the product that you want for users. So Chainhook becomes this thing that gives you this massive shortcut that immediately puts you in a place when you can start experimenting with the actual data that happens on chain, right? And this, again, I think it's very important because it saves time for developers, not only for building those things like I just mentioned, but also for even learning what those things are. I mean, sometimes developers just want to experiment and want to see what's going on. They want to throw their little, do a few lines of code here and there, just seeing what can be done. And they cannot do that if they don't have a tool like this, right? And that's why we added support for Chainhook through the Hiro platform, so you can get notifications on your contracts and on your systems when something happens on the stack chain, for example. So yeah, I think that's one of the most powerful things that we have for developer tools.
And can you talk about, for folks who might not be aware, like if I'm a builder, the differences between building something on a sidechain like Stacks versus building something with a meta protocol? Like, what are the trade-offs that I would need to be keeping in mind with those two?
Yeah, so for example, on meta protocols on the Bitcoin layer 1, like runes or ordinals, you first need to be aware that Bitcoin itself doesn't know anything about these meta protocols. It's just like an invention, right? It's a way to interpret the data that happens on Bitcoin transactions. So right off the bat, that is something that is not very easy to understand if you don't know anything about Bitcoin, right? Because you might think like, oh, okay, runes is an upgrade to Bitcoin, but it's not. It's just a way of using the mechanisms that already exist on Bitcoin, right? And putting that versus a layer 2 like stacks, it's also very different because then you get the extra functionality of smart contracts, right? Or of transactions that might react to Bitcoin state. So you have to first understand the relationship between the two chains and how that works, at least at a high level. So yeah, I think that's why we work very hard on our documentation page so that we can explain to users like, okay, what do you want to do? Do you want to build on a layer 2 with all these advantages that provides? Do you want to build on a meta protocol like Ordinals or Runes with all of these other advantages that provides? And then you can choose, right? So that's what we are trying to communicate.
Yeah, yeah. It's a lot all at once, and it makes me think of Eric's like enviable job of having to kind of like navigate developers through that sometimes in the first few hours of like them going to meeting them at an event or encouraging them to build. So Eric, do you have any perspective on the kind of like the life cycle of like what's the typical developer experience for somebody who wants to start building on layers? Is there like you write the contract first and then you figure out your data? Rafael was talking about like getting data from on-chain via chain hooks. Like what do you think is like the happy path for developers building up Bitcoin layers?
Yeah, I think from my experience and from what I've kind of absorbed from communicating with hackathon developers is, well, I think in theory, I think the best thing to start with is understanding Bitcoin. I think once you start understanding Bitcoin, then understanding the different chains comes a lot easier. But yeah, kind of like piggybacking off of what I said before, it all starts with learning clarity, I guess. Once they're able to understand how the smart contract works and how the kind of logic is relatable to what kind of project that you're building, I think next is then being able to, I guess, go on to the next step, which is making sure your smart contract is secure. So, and then that kind of ties into the workshop that was done earlier today regarding unit tests. And then from there, I think you can then kind of plan around your deployment schedule, kind of understanding like, how do you want to deploy it? You want to deploy it to either testnet first or mainnet first. And then, and then before that as well, I think you also need to understand the kind of market that you're trying to build your application for. I mean, right now there's so many different app ideas already, and different applications that have already kind of been taken or already explored, which I think is another hurdle for a lot of hackathon developers, right? Is just having a good idea.
Like a unique idea.
Exactly. I mean, we've all seen, your host of your horde of swap applications or some kind of wallet applications. But I think, having, good documentation and having resources that are provided by the DevTool team is good for them to kind of harness their idea and kind of carve it out a little bit more, a little bit better. And then, yeah, I think, once they're able to kind of have a good solid foundation of what they want to build and, getting used to the developer tools and connecting with the developer tool teams and anybody else in the Stacks ecosystem, for example, for Stacks, I think after that, the floor is all theirs. If they want to actually go forward with deploying the project to mainnet or start raising funds or looking into any incubator programs, and then yeah.
There you go from there. Yeah. So I'm hearing both of you say the happy path is like do all your homework first. You got to read about Bitcoin, then understand the fundamentals, then make an informed and educated decision about your L2. Then you do writing contracts, testing smart contracts, and then you have a fully fleshed application. That reminds me of any time I try to play a board game and you have like one group of people who's like, let's read the instructions, and then some people who are just like, no, I want to like ape in and start playing now.
Right, yeah.
And I think that also happens a lot in like learning Bitcoin layers. Like some developers just want to like click deploy and see what happens. One thing I think is interesting when thinking about the developer experience is like people's misconceptions. Like so much so where like, oh, I'm going to start building on Bitcoin layers. I'm super excited about stacks and I like Lightning. How can I bring them together? Or why don't they talk to each other? I thought that this was something that I thought was obvious, or table stakes, because it's what I'm used to seeing in Web 2 or in a different ecosystem.
Right.
What are some of the like Bitcoin layer misconceptions that we can dispel that you see or like that you've maybe encountered?
Yeah, that's a good one actually, because sometimes I've been to some developer events down in Mexico, for example, and one of the questions that I get from developers is like, hey, how come I cannot use stacks to do this or do that? Just to give you an example, right? And but it goes back to what you just said, like, in order for you to be able to communicate one chain with the other, there has to be some way of doing that via a bridge or what have you, right? So there are just too many concepts that need to be understood before you can start, doing something like as a developer, right? And for example, I'm certainly on the second camp of what you just said. Like, I'd like to just start writing code and get my hands dirty.
Everybody's talking about like you got to read documentation. I know you guys don't read documentation.
I mean,
when you're trying to build something,
you sort of read it as you go.
Yeah.
Right? But I think every developer has a different perspective on how they learn, but that's just me, right? So I think having all the options available is the best thing. But yeah, I'm going back to your question. I think there's also some a lot of debate right now going on about how different layer 2s are classified, for example, with the level of interaction that they have with the Bitcoin layer 1, what kind of data they're writing into it, what's the interaction when something happens on the layer 1, what happens to the layer 2, like a reorg on layer 1 or something like that. How does mining affect? So there's just so many things that you can really dive deep into, and you end up learning all of the different nuances that exist between the layer 2 world, including Lightning, including stacks, including too many others, right? So I would say that that's a thing that should be focused on by developers.
Yeah, it's like a blind spot.
Yeah.
Eric, what about you? Common misconceptions, myths, myth busting that we can do here?
For Bitcoin.
It could be Bitcoin, it could be stocks.
Yeah, I think,
or Ordinals.
well, I mean, I don't think I could talk too much deep into it, but I think, like, I want to take something that Munib mentioned one time at a previous panel that I saw him on, is kind of how people coming from the EVM side would always try to, I guess, place their framework of what an EVM L2 is and kind of compare it to what an L2 should be in the Bitcoin ecosystem. And I think there is a lot of nuances there that I think probably Rafael or can talk more upon. But I think that misconception, especially when a lot of new developers, and there are a lot of new developers in our ecosystem that come from the EVM side, right? And I think being able to kind of explain to them the differences between an L2 on an EVM chain versus an L2 in the Bitcoin side, I think it can kind of help them wrap their heads around more about how Stacks works, for example, and how, what are the limitations there between communicating between the Bitcoin-based chain and Stacks, for example. And it's funny too, because on that same panel, Munib did make a good point of how it was actually the Bitcoin ecosystem that came up with the layer 2 terminology.
Yeah.
And then the EVM side, they took it, and now I guess we're trying to take it back. Yeah. So.
Take it.
So yeah. I mean, I guess the misconception there is, like, layers have always been around on Bitcoin, and it just hasn't only been on the EVM side. So, but being able to explain, I guess, more in depth of the nuts and bolts of, the differences between those two ecosystems, that'll be helpful.
Yeah. One, it's not necessarily a misconception, but I think it's like almost like a cultural quirk that's different, that's unique to Bitcoin, is that in the Bitcoin ecosystem, people are really, really motivated to have their ideologies built within the tech stack. So like I want sovereign systems because Bitcoin is a sovereign foundation. So what's the point of building on Bitcoin if you're not going to do it in like a fully trustless, fully ideologically pure, completely perfect way? And the ethos in other ecosystems tends to be like, let's be more experimental. Let's try out. Like we could do more trade-offs. So seeing how now people who want to build on Bitcoin layers, it's like the perfect confluence of like, all right, how do we keep the principles of trustless bridges, maybe bridging in to trust minimized bridges, like how do we keep those ideologies, but also create an environment where we can experiment and innovate, and build cool shit on Bitcoin. That's the goal at the end of the day. Okay.
I think to also pronounce that kind of comparison to like what I've seen as well in the wallet space is that builders that are building a Bitcoin wallet, the users or the user sides, their question is the important question for them is just like how secure is it, right?
Yeah.
Whereas when you're building a Web3 wallet, a lot of the importance that the users care about is, well, how fast can you swap your tokens into a stable coin, right? It's those ideas and philosophies that a lot of Bitcoiners have. I mean, it really resonates not just to the Bitcoin chain, but just to wallets and Bitcoin layers and whatnot. So it's just an interesting kind of comparison that I've kind of spotted out. So
yeah, you're building for different use cases and slightly different people, and then you're building things that, it's not like you have a great roadmap to point to. Like the L2, the ways L2s have evolved in Ethereum is just not going to be the same playbook for the way L2s evolve in Bitcoin. Okay, we have just a few minutes left. Holy moly, time flew. Time flies when you're having fun at the Bitcoin disco. So I want to end on, there's a pretty big network upgrade coming to the Stacks ecosystem. It's one that we're very excited about at Hiro because it's going to have a huge impact on the developer experience. It's going to make, hopefully it's going to make Stacks one of the like best layers for developers to build on Bitcoin layers. So for people who might not be aware, maybe Rafa and Eric, we can end on a tiny little primer, a little teaser for how the Nakamoto network upgrade is going to improve the developer experience for Bitcoin layers.
Yeah, of course. So I think that the improvement that will impact developers and users more is speed, like by 100 miles. And what that means is that the Stacks chain will now be able to produce blocks in between two Bitcoin blocks, which is something that is not currently able to do. So that will allow developers and users to trade or swap or call contracts or whatever much faster that they can do today. So I think that the second order effect of that will be a much more improved user experience.
Mm-hmm.
So even for users that are not developers, but they want to use Stacks for DeFi or whatever, they will be able to do that much faster. So I think that is for sure the best feature of the Nakamoto upgrade.
Nice. Eric, anything to add there?
I just to add on to that, I think SBTC is going to be awesome too, right? Being able to have a trust minimized way to have your Bitcoin go from one chain, the base chain, to Stacks chain. So yeah, that's going to be awesome.
Nice. Well, thank you both for sharing those pearls of wisdom with us, with the audience. You guys heard it here first. If you want to build on Bitcoin layers, this is definitely the conference to meet and learn and talk to people. But from all of us heroes, if you get inspired by something that you hear on stage and you want to build it, please consider us a resource. We are we want to empower developers to build the vision that they have for the future of the internet on Bitcoin. And if there's anything getting in your way, you call us and we'll see what we can do to help. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.